Hello, everybody. We are here today to do a live reading with Bunnytooth from Discord. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Bunnytooth. I'm an individual,
He's an individual.
and I'm ready to kill.
Oh, hell yeah. Anyways, Poverty of Philosophy by Karl Marx. Here's the foreword. Mr. Proudhon has the misfortune of being peculiarly misunderstood in Europe and France. He has the right to be a bad economist because he's reputed to be a good German philosopher. In Germany, he has the right to be a bad philosopher because he's reputed to be one of the ablest French economists. Being both a German and economist at the same time, we desire to protest against this double error. The reader will understand that in the thankless task we have often had to abandon our criticism of Mr. Proudhon in order to criticize German philosophy, and at the same time to give some observation on political economy. Karl Marx, Brussels, June 15th, 1847. Mr. Proudhon's work is not just a treatise on political economy, an ordinary book. It is a Bible, mysteries, secrets wrested from the bosom of God, revelations. It lacks nothing. But as prophets are discussed nowadays more consciously than profane writers, the reader must resign himself to going with us through the arid and gloomy eruditions of Genesis in order to ascend later with Mr. Proudhon into the ethereal and fertile realm of super socialism. And yep, on to the poverty of philosophy. You got the document I sent you, right?
Yeah, I have it. So you just want me to read the part one, an antithesis of use value and exchange value?
Yes.
Okay. Part one, the antithesis of use value and exchange value. Quote, the capacity for all products, whether natural or industrial, to contribute to man's subsistence is specifically termed use value, their capacity to be given in exchange for one another, exchange value. How does use value become exchange value? The genesis of the idea of exchange value has not been noted by economists with sufficient care. It is necessary, therefore, for us to dwell upon it. Since a very large number of the things I need occur in nature only in moderate quantities, or even not at all, I am forced to assist the production of what I lack. And as I cannot set my hand to so many things, I shall propose to other men, my collaborators in various functions, to cede to me a part of their products in exchange for mine. End quote. Proudhon, Volume 1, Chapter 2. Mr. Proudhon undertakes to explain to us, first of all, the double nature of value, the quote-unquote distinction in value, the process by which use value is transformed into exchange value. It is necessary for us to dwell with Mr. Proudhon upon this act of transubstantiation. The following is how this act is accomplished according to our author. A very large number of products are not to be found in nature. They are products of industry. If man's needs go beyond nature's spontaneous production, he is forced to have recourse to industrial production. What is this industry in Mr. Proudhon's view? What is its origin? A single individual feeling the need for a very great number of things. Quote, cannot set his hands to so many things, end quote. So many things to produce presuppose at once more than one man's hand helping to produce them. Now, the moment you postulate more than one hand helping in production, you at once presuppose a whole production based on the division of labor. Thus need, as Mr. Proudhon presupposes it, itself presupposes the whole division of labor. In presupposing the division of labor, you get exchange and consequently exchange value. One might as well have presupposed exchange value from the very beginning. But Mr. Proudhon prefers to go the roundabout way. Let us follow him in all his detours, which always bring him back to his starting point. In order to emerge from the condition in which everyone produces in isolation and to arrive at exchange, quote, I turn to my collaborators in various functions, end quote, says Proudhon. I myself then have collaborators, all with different function. And yet, for all that, I and all the others, always according to Mr. Proudhon's supposition, have got no farther than the solitary and hardly social position of the Robinsons. The collaborators and the various functions with divisions of labor and the exchange it implies are already at hand. To sum up, I have certain needs which are founded on the division of labor and on exchange. In presupposing these needs, Mr. Proudhon has thus presupposed exchange value, the very thing of which he purposes to, quote, note the genesis with more care than other economists, end quote. Mr. Proudhon might just as well have inverted the order of things without in any way affecting the accuracy of his conclusions. To explain exchange value, we must have exchange. To explain exchange, we must have the division of labor. To explain the division of labor, we must have needs which render necessary the division of labor. To explain these needs, we must presuppose, quote unquote, them, which is not to deny them, contrary to the first axiom of Mr. Proudhon's prologue, quote, to presuppose God is to deny him, end quote, prologue, page 1. How does Mr. Proudhon, who assumes the division of labor as the known, manage to explain exchange value, which for him is always the unknown? Quote, a man, end quote, sets out to, quote, propose to other men, his collaborators in various functions, end quote, that they establish exchange and make a distinction between ordinary value and exchange value. In accepting this proposed distinction, the collaborators have left Mr. Proudhon no other, quote unquote, care than that of recording the fact or marking of, quote unquote, noting in his treatise on political economy, quote, the genesis of the idea of value, end quote. But he has still to explain to us the, quote unquote, genesis of this proposal, to tell us finally how this single individual, this Robinson Crusoe, suddenly had the idea of making, quote, to his collaborators, end quote, a proposal of the type known, and how these collaborators accepted it without the slightest protest. Mr. Proudhon does not enter into the genealogical details. He merely places a sort of historical stamp upon the fact of exchange by presenting it in the form of a motion made by a third party that exchange be established. That is an example of the, quote, historical and descriptive method of Mr. Proudhon, who professes a superb disdain for the, quote, historical and descriptive methods, end quote, of the Adam Smiths and Ricardos. Exchange has a history of its own. It has passed through different phases. There was a time, as in the Middle Ages, when only the superfluous, the excess of production over consumption, was exchanged. There was again a time when not only the superfluous, but all products, all industrial existence, had passed into commerce, when the whole of production depended on exchange. How are we to explain this second phase of exchange, marketable value, at its second power? Mr. Proudhon would have a reply ready-made. Assume that a man has, quote, proposed to other men, his collaborators, in various functions, end quote, to raise marketable value to its second power. Finally, there came a time when everything that men had considered as inalienable became an object of exchange, of traffic, and could be alienated. This is the time when the very things which till then had been communicated but never exchanged, given but never sold, acquired but never bought, virtue, love, conviction, knowledge, and conscience, etc. When everything, in short, passed into commerce, it is the time of general. Oh, sorry, just lost my place. Okay, is the time of general corruption, of universal venality, or to speak in terms of political economy, the time when everything, moral or physical, having become a marketable value, is brought to the market to be assessed at its truest value. How again can we explain this new and last phase of exchange, marketable value at its third power? Mr. Proudhon would have a reply ready made. Assume that a person, assume that a person has, quote, proposed to other persons, his collaborators in various functions, to make a marketable value of virtue, love, etc., to raise exchange value to its third and last power. We see that Mr. Proudhon's, quote, historical and descriptive method, end quote, is applicable to everything. It answers everything, explains everything. If it is a question above all of explaining historically, quote, the genesis of an economic idea, end quote, it postulates a man who proposes to other men, quote, his collaborators in various functions, end quote, that they perform this act of genesis, and that is the end of it. We shall hereafter accept the quote unquote genesis of exchange value as an accomplished act. It now remains only to expound the relation between exchange value and use value. Let us hear what Mr. Proudhon has to say. Quote, the economists have very well brought out the double character of value, but what they have not pointed out with the same precision is its contradictory nature. This is where our criticisms begins. It is a small thing to have drawn attention to this surprising contrast between use value and exchange value, in which economists have been wont to see only something very simple. We must show that this alleged simplicity conceals a profound mystery into which it is our duty to penetrate. In technical terms, use value and exchange value stand in inverse ratio to each other, end quote. If we have thoroughly grasped Mr. Proudhon's thought, the following are the 4 points which he sets out to establish. 1. Use value and exchange value form a quote-unquote surprising contrast. They are in opposition to each other. 2. Use value and exchange value are in inverse ratio, in contradiction to each other. 3. Economists have neither observed nor recognized either the opposition or the contradiction. 4. Mr. Proudhon's criticisms begins at the end. We too shall begin at the end, and in order to clear the economists from Mr. Proudhon's accusations, we shall let 2 sufficiently well-known economists speak for themselves. Sismondi, quote, it is the opposition between use value and exchange value to which commerce has reduced everything, etc., end quote. And Lauderdale, quote, in proportion as the as the riches of individuals are increased by the augmentation of value of any commodity, the wealth of society is generally diminished. And in proportion as the mass of individual riches is diminished by the diminution of the value of any commodity, its opulence is generally increased, end quote. Sismondi founded on the opposition between use value and exchange value his principal doctrine, according to which diminution in revenue is proportional to the increase in production. Lauderdale founded his system on the inverse ratio of the two kinds of value, and his doctrine was indeed so popular in Ricardo's time that the latter could speak of it as of something generally known. Quote, "It is through confounding the ideas of value and wealth or riches that it has been asserted that by diminishing the quantity of commodities, that is to say, of the necessaries, conveniences, and enjoyments of human life, riches may be increased," end quote. This is from Dave Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy. We have just seen that the economists before Mr. Proudhon had, quote unquote, drawn attention to the profound mystery of opposition and contradiction. Let us now see how Mr. Proudhon explains this mystery after the economists. The exchange value of a product falls as the supply increases, the demand remaining the same. In other words, the more abundant a product is relatively to the demand, the lower is its exchange value or price. Vice versa, the weaker the supply relatively to the demand, the higher rises the exchange value or the price of the product supplied. In other words, the greater the scarcity in the product supplied relatively to the demand, the higher the prices. The exchange value of a product depends upon its abundance or its scarcity, but always in relation to the demand. Take a product that is more than scarce, unique of its kind, if you will. This unique product will be more than abundant. It will be superfluous if there is no demand for it. On the other hand, take a product multiplied into millions. It will always be scarce if it does not satisfy the demand. That is, if there is too great a demand for it. These are what we should almost call truisms. Yet we have had to repeat them here in order to render Mr. Proudhon's mysteries comprehensible. Quote, so that following up the principle to its ultimate consequences, one would come to the conclusion, the most logical in the world, that the things whose use is indispensable and whose quantity is unlimited should be had for nothing, and those whose utility is nil and whose scarcity is extreme should be incalculable worth. To cap the difficulty, these extremes are impossible in practice. On the one hand, no human product could ever be unlimited in magnitude. On the other, even the scarcest things must perforce be useful to a certain degree. Otherwise, they would be quite valueless. Use value and exchange value are thus inexorably bound up with each other, although by their nature they continually tend to be mutually exclusive, end quote. Volume 1, page 39, from Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. What caps Mr. Proudhon's difficulty? That he has simply forgotten about demand, and that a thing can be scarce or abundant only insofar as it is in demand. The moment he leaves out demand, he identifies exchange value with scarcity and use value with abundance. In reality, in saying that things, quote, whose utility is nil and scarcity extreme, are of incalculable worth, unquote. He is simply declaring that exchange value is merely scarcity. Quote, scarcity extreme and utility nil, unquote, means pure scarcity. Quote, incalculable worth, end quote, is the maximum of exchange value. It is pure exchange value. He equates these two terms. Therefore, exchange value and scarcity are equivalent terms. In arriving at these alleged, quote unquote, extreme consequences, Mr. Proudhon has in fact carried to the extreme not the things, but the terms which express them. And in so doing, he shows proficiencies in rhetoric rather than in logic. He merely rediscovers his first hypotheses in all their nakedness. When he thinks he has discovered new consequences, thanks to the same. When he thinks he has discovered new consequences, thanks to the same procedures, he succeeds in identifying use value with pure abundance. After having equated exchange value and scarcity, use value and abundance, Mr. Proudhon is quite astonished not to find use value in scarcity and exchange value, nor exchange value in abundance and use value. And seeing that these extremes are impossible in practice, he can do nothing but believe in mystery. Incalculable worth exists for him because buyers do not exist, and he will never find any buyers so long as he leaves out demand. On the other hand, Mr. Proudhon's abundance seems to be something spontaneous. He completely forgets that there are people who produce it, and that it is to their interest never to lose sight of demand. Otherwise, how could Mr. Proudhon have said that things which are very useful must have a very low price or even cost nothing? On the contrary, he should have concluded that abundance, the production of very useful things, should be restricted if their price, their exchange value, is to be raised. The old vine growers of France, in petitioning for a law to forbid the planting of new vines, the Dutch in burning Asiatic spices, in uprooting clove trees in the I think it's Moluccas, were simply trying to reduce abundance in order to raise exchange value. During the whole of the Middle Ages, this same principle was acted upon in limiting by laws the number of journeymen a single master could employ and number of implements he could use. See Anderson's History of Commerce. After having represented abundance as use value and scarcity as exchange value, nothing indeed is easier than to prove that abundance and scarcity are in an inverse ratio. Mr. Proudhon's identifies use value with supply and exchange value with demand. To make the antithesis even more clear cut, he substitutes a new term, putting quote unquote estimation value instead of exchange value. The battle has now shifted its ground, and we have on one side utility, use value, supply, on the other side estimation, exchange value, demand. Who is to reconcile these contradictory forces? What is to be done to bring them into harmony with each other? Is it possible to find in them even a single point of comparison? Quote, Certainly, cries Mr. Proudhon, there is one free will. The price resulting from this battle between supply and demand, between utility and estimation, will not be the expression of eternal justice. End quote. Mr. Proudhon goes on to develop this antithesis. Quote, in my capacity as a free buyer, I am judge of my needs, judge of the desirability of an object, judge of the price I'm willing to pay for it. On the other hand, in your capacity as a free producer, you are the master of the means of execution, and in consequence, you have the power to reduce your expenses. End quote. Volume 1, page 41. And as demand or exchange value, it is identical with estimation. Mr. Proudhon is led to say, quote, it is proved that it is man's free will, that gives rise to the opposition between use value and exchange value. How can this opposition be removed? So long as free will exists, and how can the latter be sacrificed without sacrificing mankind? End quote. Volume 1, page 41 as well. Thus, there is no possible way out. There is a struggle between two, as it were, incommensurable powers, between utility and estimation, between the free buyer and the free producer. Let us look at things a little more closely. Supply does not represent exclusively utility. Demand does not represent exclusively estimation. Does not the demander also supply a certain product or the token representing all products, viz. Money? And as supplier, does he not represent, according to Proudhon, utility or use value? Again, does not the supplier also demand a certain product or the token representing all product, viz. Money? And does he not thus become the representative of estimation value, or of exchange value? Demand is at the same time a supply. Supply is at the same time a demand. Thus, Mr. Proudhon's antithesis in simply identifying supply and demand, the one with utility, the other with estimation, is based only on a futile abstraction. What Mr. Proudhon calls use value is called estimation value by other economists, and with just as much right, we shall quote only Stork. I don't know how to say that, but this comes from a thing. According to him, needs are the thing for which we feel the need. Values are things to which we attribute value. Most things have value only because they satisfy needs engendered by estimation. The estimation of our needs may change. Therefore, the utility of things, which expresses only the relation of these things to our needs, may also change. Natural needs themselves are continually changing. Indeed, what could be more varied than the objects which form the staple food of different peoples? The conflict does not take place between utility and estimation. It takes place between the marketable value demanded by the supplier and the marketable value supplied by the demander. The exchange value of the product is each time the resultant of these contradictory appreciations. In final analysis, supply and demand bring together production and consumption, but production and consumption based on individual exchanges. The product supplied is not useful in itself. It is the consumer who determines its utility, And even when its quality of being useful is admitted, it does not exclusively represent utility. In the course of production, it has been exchanged for all the costs of production, such as raw materials, wages of workers, etc., all of which are marketable values. The product therefore represents, in the eyes of the producer, a sum total of marketable values. What he supplies is not only a useful object, but also and above all, a marketable value. As to demand, it will only be effective on condition that it has means of exchange at its disposal. These means are themselves products, marketable value. In supply and demand, then, we find on the one hand a product which has cost marketable values and the need to sell. On the other, means which have cost marketable values and the desire to buy. Mr. Proudhon opposes the free buyer to the free producer. To the one and to the other, he attributes purely metaphysical qualities. It is this that makes him say, quote, "It is proved that it is man's free will that gives rise to the opposition between use value and exchange value," end quote. The producer, the moment he produces in a society founded on the division of labor and on exchange, and that is Mr. Proudhon's hypothesis, is forced to sell. Mr. Proudhon makes the producer master of the means of production, but he will agree with us that his means of production do not depend on free will. Moreover, many of these means of production are products which he gets from the outside, and in modern production, he is not even free to produce the amounts he wants. The actual degree of development of the productive forces compels him to produce on such or such a scale. The consumer is no freer than the producer. His judgment depends on his means and his needs. Both of these are determined by his social position, which itself depends on the whole social organization. True, the worker who buys potatoes and the kept woman who buys lace both follow their respective judgments, but the difference in their judgment is explained by the difference in the positions which they occupy in the world, in which themselves are the product of social organization. Is the entire system of needs on estimation or on the whole organization of production? Most often, needs arise directly from production or from a state of affairs based on production. Thus, to choose another example, does not the need for lawyers suppose a given civil law, which is but the expression of a certain development of property, that is to say, of production? It is not enough for Mr. Proudhon to have eliminated the elements just mentioned from the relation of supply and demand. He carries abstraction to the furthest limits when he fuses all producers into one single producer, all consumers into one single consumer, and sets up a struggle between these two chimerical personages. But in the real world, things happen otherwise. The competition among the suppliers and the competitors among the demanders form a necessary part of the struggle between buyers and sellers, of which a marketable value is the result. After having eliminated competition and the cost of production, Mr. Proudhon can at his ease reduce the formula of supply and demand to an absurdity. Quote, "Supply and demand," he says, "are merely two ceremonial forms that serve to bring use value and exchange value face to face. And to lead their reconciliation, they are the two electric poles which, when connected, must produce the phenomenon of affinity called exchange, end quote. Volume 1, page 49 and 50. One might as well say that exchange is merely a quote unquote ceremonial form for introducing the consumer to the object of consumption. One might as well say that all economic relations are quote unquote ceremonial forms, serving immediate consumption as go betweens. Supply and demand are either more nor less relations of a given production than are individual exchanges. What then does all Mr. Proudhon's dialectic consist in? In the substitution for use value and exchange value for supply and demand of abstract and contradictory notions like scarcity and abundance, utility and estimation, one producer and one consumer, both of them knights of free will. And what was he aiming at? At arranging for himself a means of introducing later on one of the elements he had set aside, the cost of production, as the synthesis of use value and exchange value. And it is thus that in his eyes, the cost of production constitutes synthetic value or constituted value.
Next, constituted value or synthetic value. Okay, goody. This segment is way longer, so I'm going to read it faster. Number 2, constituted value or synthetic value. Value, marketable value, is the cornerstone of economic structure. Constituted value is the cornerstone of the system of economic contradictions. What then is the constituted value, which is all Mr. Proudhon has discovered in political economy? One utility is admitted. Labor is the source of all value. The measure of labor is time. The relative value of products is determined by the labor time required for their production. Price is the monetary expression of the relative value of a product. Finally, the constituted value of a product is purely and simply the value in which it is constituted by the labor time incorporated in it. Just as Adam Smith discovered the division of labor, so he, Mr. Proudhon, claims to have discovered, quote, constituted value. This is not exactly something unheard of. But then it must be admitted that there's nothing unheard of in any discovery of economic science. Mr. Proudhon, who fully appreciates the importance of his own invention, seeks nevertheless to tone down the merit before, quote, in order to reassure the reader that as his claims of originality, and to win over the minds of those timidly renders them little favor to new ideas, unquote. But in apportioning the contribution made in each of his predecessors to the understanding of value, he is forced to compress openly that the largest portion, the lion's share, of the merit falls to himself. Quote, the synthetic idea of value has been vaguely perceived by Adam Smith, but with Adam Smith the idea of value was entirely intuitive. Now society does not exchange its habits merely on the strength of intuitions. Its decisions are made only by the authority of facts, and the anatomy had to be stated more palpably and more clearly. J.B. says its chief interpreter, unquote. Here, in a nutshell, is the history of the discovery of synthetic value. Adam Smith, vague intuition, J.B. says. Anatomy, Mr. Proudhon, constituting the constituted truth, and let there be no mistake about it. All the other economists, from Say to Proudhon, have merely been trudging along in the rut of antimony.
I think it's
antimony.
Antinomy, yeah.
Okay, there we go. I've never heard of that word in my life.
It means a contradiction between two beliefs or conclusions that are in themselves reasonable, a paradox.
Right. Anyways, quote, it is incredible that for the last 40 years, so many men of sense should have fumed and fretted at such a simple idea. But no, values are compared without there being any point of comparison between them, and with no unit of measurements. Thus, rather than embrace the revolutionary theory of equality, is what the economists of the 19th century are resolved to uphold against all comers. What will posterity say about it, unquote. Posterity, so abruptly invoked, will begin by getting muddled over the chronology. It is bound to ask itself, are not Ricardo and his school of economists of the 19th century? Ricardo's system, putting as a principle that, quote, the relative value of commodities corresponds exclusively to their production, unquote, dates back to 1817. Ricardo is the head of the whole school dominant in England since the Restoration. The Restoration began after the termination of the Napoleonic Wars and the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty in France in 1815. The Ricardian doctrine summarizes severely, remorselessly, the whole of the English bourgeoisie. Quote, what will posterity say about it, unquote? It will not say that Mr. Proudhon did not know Ricardo, for he talks about him, he talks at length about him, he keeps him coming back to him, and concludes by calling his system, quote, trash, unquote. If ever posterity does interfere, it will say perhaps that Mr. Proudhon, afraid of offending his readers' Anglophobia, preferred to make himself the responsible editor of Ricardo's ideas. In any case, it will think it's very naive that Mr. Proudhon should give as a revolutionary theory of the future what Ricardo expounded scientifically as the theory of present-day society, of bourgeois society, and that he should thus take for the solution of the antimony between utility and exchange value what Ricardo and his school presented long before him as scientific formula on a single side of the antimony, that is, exchange value. But let us leave posterity alone once and for all, and confront Mr. Proudhon with his predecessor Ricardo. Here are some of the extracts from this author which summarize his doctrine on value. Quote, utility is not the measure of exchangeable value, although it is absolutely essential to it, unquote. Volume 1, Part 3, Principles de l'économie politique, translated from English, whatever. Quote, possibility commodities derive their exchange value from two sources, from their scarcity and from the quantity of labor required to obtain them. There are some commodities, the value of which is determined by their scarcity alone. No labor can increase the quantity of such goods, and therefore their value cannot be lowered by an increased supply. Some rare statues and pictures, scarce books, are all of this description. Their value varies with varying wealth and inclinations of those who are desirous to possess them, unquote. Quote, these commodities, however, form a very small part of the mass of commodities daily exchanged in the market. By far the greatest part of these goods, which are the objects of desire, are procured by labor, and they may be multiplied, not in one country alone, but in many, almost without any assignable limit, if we dispose to bestow the labor necessary to obtain them, unquote. Quote, I speak then of commodities, of their exchange value, and of the laws which regulate their relative prices. We mean always such commodities only as can be increased in quantity by the exertion of human industry, and on the production of which competition operates without restraint, unquote. Ricardo quotes Adam Smith, who, according to him, quote, so accurately defined the original source of exchangeable value, unquote. Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, Volume 1, Chapter 5, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, first edition appearing in London, 1776. And he adds, quote, that this, i.e. labor time, is really the foundation of exchangeable value in all things, excepting those which cannot be increased by human industry. It is a doctrine of the utmost importance of political economy, for from no source do so many errors and so much differentiative opinion in that science proceed, as from the vague ideas which are attached to the word value, unquote. Quote, if the quantity of labor realized in commodities regulate their exchangeable value, every increase in the quantity of labor must augment the value of the commodity in which is exercised, as every diminution must lower it, unquote. Ricardo goes on to reproach Smith. Number one, with having, quote, himself erected another standard of the measure of value, quote, than labor, quote. Sometimes he speaks of corn, at other times labor, as a standard measure, not the quantity of labor bestowed upon production of any object, but the quantity it can be commanded in the market, unquote. Number two, with having, quote, admitted the principle without qualification, and at the same time restricted its application to that early and rude state of society, which proceeds both as accumulation of stock and the appropriation of land, unquote. Volume 1, page 21. Ricardo set out to prove that the ownership of land, that is, ground rent, cannot exchange the relative value of commodities, that the accumulation of capital has only a passing and fluctuation effect on the relative values determined by the comparative quantity of labor expended upon their production. In support of this thesis, he gives his famous theory of ground rent, analysis capital, and ultimately finds nothing in it but accumulated labor. Then he develops a whole theory of wages and profits, and proves that wages and profits rise and fall inverse to the ratio of each other, without affecting the relative value of the product. He does not neglect the influence that the accumulation of capital and its divergent aspects, fixed capital and circulating capital, also the rate of wages, can have on the proportional value of products. In fact, they are chief problems which Ricardo is concerned. Quote, economy is the use of labor never fails to reduce relative value of a commodity, whether the savings be in the labor necessary to manufacture the commodity itself, or in that necessary to the formulation of the capital by the aid of which it is produced, unquote. Quote, under such circumstance, the value of the deer, the produce of the hunter day's labor, would be exactly equal to the value of the fish, the produce of the fisherman's day's labor. The comparative value of the fish and the game would be entirely regulated by the quantity of labor realized in each, whatever might be the quantity of production, or however high or low general wages or profits might be, unquote. Quote, in making labor the foundation of value of commodities and the comparative quantity of labor which is necessary to their production, the rule which determines the respective quantities of goods which shall be given in exchanging for each other, we must not be supposed to deny the accidental and temporary deviations of the actual or market price of commodities from this, their primary and natural price. Quote, it is the cost of production which must ultimately regulate the price of commodities, and not, as it has often been said, the proportion between supply and demand, unquote. Volume 2, page 253. Lord Lauderdale had developed the variations of exchange value according to the law of supply and demand, or of scarcity and abundance relatively to demand. In his opinion, the value of such a thing can increase when its quantity decreases or when the demand for it increases. It can decrease owing to an increase in its quantity or owing to a decrease in demand. Thus, the value of a thing can be exchanged through 8 different causes, namely 4 causes that apply to money or to any other commodity which serves as a measure of its value. Here's Ricardo's refutation. Quote, commodities which are monopolized, either by an individual or by a company, vary accordingly to the law which Lord Lauderdale has laid down. They fall in proportion as sellers augments their quantity, and rise in proportion to the eagerness of the buyers to purchase them. Their price has no necessary connection with their natural value, but the prices of commodities, which are subject to competition, and those quantities may be increased in any moderate degree, will ultimately depend not on the state of demand and supply, but on the increased or diminished cost of their production, unquote. Volume 2, page 259. We shall leave it to the reader to make their comparison between this simple, clear, precise language of Ricardo and Mr. Proudhon's rhetorical attempts to arrive at the determination of relative value by labor time. Ricardo shows us the real movement of bourgeois production, which constitutes value. Mr. Proudhon, leaving the real movements out of account, fumes and frets in order to invent new processes and to achieve the reorganization of the world on a would-be new formula, which formula is no more than the theoretical expression of the real movements which exists, and which is so well described by Ricardo. Ricardo takes his starting point from present-day society to demonstrate to us how it constitutes value. Mr. Proudhon takes constituted value as his starting point to construct a new social world with the aid of this value. From him, Mr. Proudhon constituted value must have moved and become once more the constituting factor in a world already completely constituted according to this mode of evaluation. The determination of value by labor time for Ricardo, the law of exchange value for Mr. Proudhon, it is the synthesis of use value and exchange value. Ricardo's theory of value is the scientific interpretation of actual economic life. Mr. Proudhon's theory of value is the utopian interpretation of Ricardo's theory. Ricardo establishes that the truth of this formula by deriving it from all economic relations, and by explaining it in this way all phenomena. even those like ground rent, accumulation of capital, and the relation of wages to profits, which at first might seem to contradict it. It is precisely that which makes his doctrine a scientific system. Mr. Proudhon, who has rediscovered this formula of Ricardo by means of quite arbitrary hypotheses, is forced to thereafter seek out isolated economic facts, which he twists and falsifies to pass them off as examples, already existing applications, beginning of realization of his regenerating idea. CR S3, Application and Constituted Value. Now let us pass over to the conclusions Mr. Proudhon draws from the value constituted by labor time. A certain quantity of labor is equivalent to the products created by this same quantity of labor. Each day's labor is worth much as another day's labor. That is to say, if the quantities are equal, one man's labor is worth as much as another man's labor. There is no qualitative difference. With the same quantity of work, one man's product can be given in exchange for another man's product. All men are wage workers getting paid equal for an equal time of work. Perfect equality rules the exchanges. Are these conclusions the strict natural consequences of value constituted or determined by labor time? If the relative value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor derived to produce it, it follows naturally that the relative value of labor, or wages, is likewise determined by the quantity of labor needed to produce the wages. Wages, that is, the relative value or price of labor, are thus determined by the labor time needed to produce all that is necessary for the maintenance of the worker. Quote, diminish the cost of production of hats, their price will ultimately fall to their own new natural price, although the demand should be doubled, trebled, or quadrupled. Diminish the cost of subsistence of men by diminishing the natural price of food and clothing, by which life is sustained, and wages will ultimately fall, notwithstanding the demand for labors may very greatly increase. Unquote. Ricardo, Volume 2, page 253. Doubtless, Ricardo's language is as cynical as can be. To put the cost of manufacture of hats and the cost of maintenance of men on the same plane is to turn men into hats. But do not make an outcry of the cynicism of it. The cynicism is in the facts, and not in the words which express the facts. French writers like M.M. Draws, Blanqui, Rossi, and others take an innocent satisfaction in proving their superiority over the English economists by seeking to observe the etiquettes of, quote, humanitarian phraseology. If they reproach Ricardo and his school for their cynical language, it is because it annoys them to see their economic relations exposed in all their crudity, to see the mysteries of the bourgeoisie unmasked. To sum up, labor, being itself a commodity, is measured as such by the labor time needed to produce the labor commodity. And what is needed to produce the labor commodity? Just enough labor time to produce the objects indispensable to the constant maintenance of labor. That is, to keep the worker alive and in a condition to propagate his race. The natural price of labor is no other than the minimum wage. If the current rate of wages rises above this natural price, it is precisely because the law of profit the law of value put as a principle by Mr. Proudhon happens to be counterbalanced by the consequences of the varying relations of supply and demand. But the minimum wage is nonetheless the center towards which the current rates of wages gravitate. Thus, relative value, measured by labor time, is inevitably the formula of the present enslavement of the worker, instead of being, as Mr. Proudhon would have it, the revolutionary theory of the emancipation of the proletariat. Let us now see to what extent the application of labor time as a measure of value is incompatible with the existing class antagonism and the unequal distribution of the product between the immediate worker and the owner of accumulated labor. Let us take a particular product, broadcloth, which has required the same quantity of labor as the linen. If there is an exchange of these two products, there is an exchange equal to quantities of labor. In exchange of these equal quantities of labor time, one does not exchange the reciprocal position of the producers, any more than one changes anything in the situation of the worker and manufacturers among themselves. To say that this exchange of products is measured by labor time results in an equality of payments for all the producers is to presuppose that equality of participation in the product existed before the exchange. When the exchange of broadcloth for linen has been accomplished, the producer of broadcloth will share the linen in proportion equal to that which they previously shared in the broadcloth. Mr. Proudhon's illusion is brought about by taking it for its consequence. Excuse me. Mr. Proudhon's illusion is brought about by his taking for a consequence what could be at most a gratuitous supposition. Let us go further. Does labor time, as the measure of value, suppose at least that the days are equivalent, and that one man's day is worth another man's? No. Let us suppose for a moment that the jeweler's day is equivalent to 3 days of a weaver. The fact remains that any change in the value of jewels relative to the woman's material, unless it be the transitory result of the fluctuations of supply and demand, must have its cause a reduction or an increase in the labor time expended in the production of one or the other. If 3 working days of different workers be related to one another by a ratio of 1, 2, and 3, then every change in the relative value of the products will be a change in the same proportion of 1, 2, and 3. Thus, values can be measured by labor time, in spite of the inequality of value of different working days, but to apply such measure, we must have a comparative scale of the different working days. It is competition that sets up this scale. Is your hour's labor worth mine? That is the question which is decided by competition. Competition, according to an American economist, determines how many days of simple labor are contained in one day's compound labor. Does not this reduction of days of compound labor to days of simple labor suppose that simple labor is itself taken as a measure of value? If the mere quantity of labor functions as a measure of value regardless of quantity, it presupposes that simple labor has become the pivot of industry. It presupposes that labor has been equalized by the subordination of man to the machine or by the extreme division of labor. That men are efficated by their labor, that the pendulum of the clock has become as accurate a measure of the relative activity of 2 workers as it is the speed of 2 locomotives. Therefore, we should not say that one man's hour is worth another man's hour, but rather one man's during an hour is worth just as much as another man's during an hour. Time is everything. Man is nothing. He is at the most times carcass. Quality no longer matters. Quantity alone decides everything, hour for hour, day for day. But this equalizing of labor does not mean that the work of Mr. Proudhon's eternal justice. It is purely and simply a fact of modern industry. In the automatic workshop, one worker's labor is scarcely distinguishable in any way from another worker's labor. Workers can be distinguished from one another by the length of time they take for their work. Nevertheless, this quantitative difference becomes, from a certain point of view, qualitative, and that the time that they take for their work depends partly on pure material causes, such as physical constitution, age, and sex, partly on purely negative moral causes such as patience, imperturbability, diligence. In short, if there's a difference of quality in the labor of different workers, it is at most a quality of the last kind, which is far from being distinctive speciality. This is what the state of affairs in modern industry amounts to in the last analysis. It is upon this equality already realized in automatic labor that Mr. Proudhon wields his smooth plane of equalization, which he means to establish universally in quote, time to come. All the equalization consequences which Mr. Proudhon deduces from Ricardo's doctrine are based on a fundamental error. He confounds the value of commodities measured by the quantity of labor embodied in them with the value of all commodities measured by the value of labor. If these 2 ways of measuring the value of commodities were equivalent, it could be said indifferently that the relative value of any commodity is measured by the quantity of labor embodied in it, or that it is measured by the quantity of labor it can buy, or again, that it is measured by the quantity of labor which can acquire it. But this is far from being so. The value of labor can no more serve as a measure of value than the value of any other commodity. A few examples will suffice to explain still better than what we have just stated. If a quarter of corn cost 2 days' labor instead of 1, it would have twice its original value. but it would not set in the operation double the quantity of labor, because it would contain no more nutritious matter than before. Thus, the value of the corn, measured by the quantity of labor used to produce it, would have doubled, but the measure of either the quantity of labor it can buy or the quantity of labor in which it can be bought, it would be far from having doubled. On the other hand, if the same labor produced twice as many clothes as before, their relative value would fall by half. But nevertheless, this double quantity of clothing would not thereby be reduced to disposing over only half the quantity of labor. Nor could the same labor command the double quantity of clothing, for half the clothes would still go on rendering the worker the same service as before. Thus, it is going against economic facts to determine the relative value of commodities by the value of labor. It is moving in vicious circle. It is to determine relative value by a relative value, which itself needs to be determined. It is beyond a doubt that Mr. Proudhon confuses the two measures by the labor time needed for the production of a commodity and measures by the value of the labor. Quote, any man's labor, he says, quote, can buy the value it represents. Thus, according to him, a certain quantity of labor embodied in products is equivalent to a worker's payment, that is, to the value of labor. It is the same reasoning that makes him confuse the cost of production with wages. Quote, what are wages? They are the cost price of corn, etc., the integral price of all things. Let us go still further. Quote, wages are the proportionality of the elements which compose wealth. What are wages? They are the value of labor. Adam Smith takes the measure of value. Now the time of labor needed for the production of a commodity, now the value of labor. Ricardo exposes this error by showing clearly the disparity of these two ways of measuring. Mr. Proudhon goes one better than Adam Smith in error by identifying the two things which the latter had merely put in juxtaposition. It is in order to find the proper proportion in which workers share in the products, or in other words, to determine the relative value of labor, that Mr. Proudhon seeks a measure of the relative value of commodities. To find out the measure of the relative value of commodities, he can think of nothing better than to give us the equivalent of a certain quantity of labor, the sum total of its products it has created, which is as good as supposing that the whole of society consists merely of workers who create their own produce as wages. In the second place, for the granted the equivalence of the working days of different workers. In short, he seeks the measure of relative value in commoditization in order to arrive at equal payments for their workers. And he takes the equality of wages as an already established fact in order to go on the search for the relative value of commodities. What an admirable dialectics. Quote, say, and the economists have observed that labor being itself subject to valuation, being a commodity like any other commodity, it is moving in a vicious circle to treat it as the principle and the determining cause of value. In so doing, these economists, if they will allow me to say so, show a prodigious carelessness. Labor is said to have value not as a commodity itself, but in view of the value in which it supposedly potentially contain. The value of labor is a figurative expression, an anticipation of the cause for the effect. It is a fiction of the same stamp of the productivity of capital. Labor produces, capital has value. By a sort of ellipses, one speaks of one value of another. Quote, labor, like liberty, is a thing vague and indeterminate by nature, but defined qualitatively by an object. That is to say, it becomes a reality by a product. Quote, but is there any need to dwell on this? The moment the economist, read Mr. Proudhon, changes the name of things, vera rerum vocabula, he is implicitly confessing his importance and proclaiming himself not privy to the cause, unquote. Proudhon 1, page 88. We have seen that Mr. Proudhon takes the value of labor, the, quote, determining cause of the value of products, to such an extent that for him, wages, the official name for the value of labor, form the integral price of all things. That is why, say, objection troubles him. In labor as a commodity, which is a grim reality, he sees nothing but a grammatical ellipsis. Thus, the whole of existing society, founded on labor as a commodity, is henceforth founded on poetic license, a figurative expression. If society wants to, quote, eliminate all the drawbacks that assail it, then let it eliminate all ill-sounding terms, change the language, and to this end, it is only to apply to the Academy for a new edition of its dictionary. After all, we have just seen, it is easy for us to understand why Mr. Proudhon, in work on political economy, has to enter upon long dissertations on etymology and other parts of grammar. Thus, he is still learnedly discussing the antiquated derivation of servus, a slave, from a servere, to preserve. These philosophical dissertations have a deep meaning, an esoteric meaning. They form an essential part of Mr. Proudhon's arguments. Labor, inasmuch as it is bought and sold, is a commodity like any other commodity, and has, in consequence, an exchange value. But the value of labor, or labor as a commodity, produces as little value as wheat, or as wheat as a commodity serves as food. Labor is worth more or less according to whether food commodities are more or less dear, whether the supply and demand of hands exists to such a degree, etc., etc. Labor is not a value thing. It is always some definite labor. It is never labor in general that is bought and sold. It is not only labor that is qualitatively defined by the object, but it is also the object which is determined by the specific quality of labor. Labor is, insofar as it is bought and sold, is itself a commodity. Why is it bought? Quote, because of the values it is supposedly potentially to contain, unquote. I botched that. Quote, because of the values it is supposed to potentially to contain, unquote. But if a certain thing is said to be a commodity, there is no longer any question as to the reason why it is bought. That is, as to the utility to be derived from it, the application to be made of it. It is a commodity as an object of traffic. All Mr. Proudhon's arguments are limited to this. Labor is not bought as an immediate object of consumption. No, it is bought as an instrument of production, as a machine would be bought, as a commodity. Labor has no value and does not produce. Mr. Proudhon might have just as well said that there is no such thing as a commodity, since every commodity is obtained merely for some utilitarian purpose, and never as a commodity in and of itself. In measuring the value of commodities by labor, Mr. Proudhon vaguely glimpses the impossibility of excluding labor from this same measure. Insofar as labor has value, as labor is a commodity, he has a misgiving that is turning the minimum wage into the natural and normal price of immediate labor. That is, it is accepting the existing state of society. So to get away from this fatal consequence, he faces about and asserts that labor is not a commodity, but it cannot have value. He forgets that he himself has taken the value of labor as a measure. He forgets that his whole system rests on labor as a commodity, on labor which is bartered, bought, sold, exchanged for produce, etc. On labor, in fact, which is an immediate source of income for the worker. He forgets everything. To save his system, he consents to sacrifice its basis, its proper vital, et propter vitam vivendi perder caucus. We now come to the new definition of, quote, constituted value. Quote, value is the proportional relation to the products which constitute wealth, unquote. Let us note, in the first place, that the single phrase relative or exchange value implies the idea that some relation in which products are exchanged reciprocally. By giving the name, quote, proportional relation to this relation, no change is made in relative value except in this exclamation. Neither the depreciation nor the enchantment of the value of a product destroys its quantity to being in some, quote, proportional relation with the other products which constitute wealth. Why is it in this new term, which introduces no new idea? Quote, proportional relations suggest many other economic relations, such as proportionality in production, the true proportion between supply and demand, etc. And Mr. Proudhon is thinking of all that when he formulates this didactic paraphrase of marketable value. In the first place, the relative value of products being determined by the comparative amount of labor used in production of each of them, proportional relations applied to this special case stand for the respective quota of products which can be manufactured in a given time, and which in consequence are given in exchange for one another. Let us see the advantage of Mr. Proudhon draws from this proportional relation. Everyone knows when supply and demand are evenly balanced, the relative value of any product is accurately determined by the quantity of labor embodied in it. That is to say, that this relative value expresses the proportional relation precisely in the sense that we have just attached to it. Mr. Proudhon inverts the order of things. Begin, he says, by measuring the relative value of a product by the quantity of labor embodied in it, and supply and demand will infallibly balance one another. Proudhon will correspond to consumption. The product will always be exchangeable. Its current price will express exactly as its true value. Instead of saying, like everyone else, when the weather is fine, a lot of people are going to be going out for a walk. Mr. Proudhon makes his people go out for a walk in order to be able to ensure them fine weather. What Mr. Proudhon gives as a consequence of marketable value determined a priori. What Mr. Proudhon gives as a consequence of marketable value determines a priori by labor time could be justified only by a law couched more or less in the following terms. Products will in the future be exchanged in the exact ratio of labor time they have cost. Whatever may be the proportion of supply and demand, the exchange of commodities will always be made as if they have just been produced proportionally to the demand. Let Mr. Proudhon take upon himself to formulate and lay down such a law, and we shall derive him of the necessity of giving proofs. If, on one hand, he insists on justifying his theory, not as a legislator, but as an economist, he will have to prove that the time needed to create a commodity indicates everything the degree of its utility and marks its proportional relations to the demand, and in consequence, the total amount of wealth. In this case, if its product is sold at a price equal to its cost of production, supply and demand will be evenly balanced, for the cost of production is supposed to express the true relations between supply and demand. Actually, Mr. Proudhon sets out to prove that labor time needed to create a product indicates its true proportional relation to needs, so that the things whose production costs the least time are the most immediately useful, and so on. Step by step, the mere production of a luxury object proves at once, according to this doctrine, that society has spare time which allows it to satisfy the needs for luxury. Mr. Proudhon finds the very proof of this thesis in the observation of the most useful things cost the least time to produce, that society always begins with the easiest industries and successively, quote, starts on the production of objects which cost more labor time, which corresponds to higher order of needs, unquote. Mr. Proudhon borrows from Mr. Dunoyer in the example of extractive industry, i.e., fruit gathering, pasturing, hunting, fishing, etc., which is the simplest, the least costly of industries, and the ones which man began, quote, at the first day of his second creation. The first day of his first creation is recorded in Genesis, which shows God as the world's first manufacturer. Things happen in quite a different way from what Mr. Proudhon imagines. The very moment civilization begins, production begins to be founded on the antagonism of orders, estates, classes, and finally on the antagonism of accumulated labor and actual labor. No antagonisms, no progress. This is the law that civilization has followed up to our days. Till now, the productive forces have been developed by virtue of this system of class antagonisms. To say now that because all the needs of all the workers were satisfied, men could devote themselves to the creation of products of a higher order, to more complicated industries, would be to leave class antagonisms out of account and turn all historical developments upside down. It's like saying that because under the Roman emperors, Myrrhina were fattened in artificial fish ponds, therefore there was enough to feed abundantly the whole Roman population, excuse me. Actually, on the contrary, the Roman people had not enough to buy bread with, while the Roman aristocrats had slaves enough to throw as fodder to the Murena. The price of food had almost continuously risen, while the price of manufactured and luxury goods had almost continuously fallen. Take the agricultural industry itself. The most indispensable objects like corn, meat, rise in price, while cotton, sugar, coffee, etc., fall in surprising proportion. And even among comestibles proper, the luxury articles like artichokes, asparagus, etc., are today relatively cheaper than foodstuff of prime necessity. In our age, the superfluous is easier to produce than the necessity. Finally, at a different historical epochs, the reciprocal price relations are not only different, but as opposed to one another. In the whole of the Middle Ages, agricultural products were relatively cheaper than manufactured products. In modern times, they are the inverse ratio. Does this mean that the utility of agricultural products has diminished since the Middle Ages? The use of products is determined by the social conditions in which consumers find themselves placed, and these conditions themselves are based on class antagonism. Cotton, potatoes, and spirits are objects of the most common use. Potatoes have engendered scrofula. Cotton has to a great extent driven out flax and wool, although wool and flax are in many cases of greater utility, if only from the point of view of the hygiene. Finally, spirits have got the upper hand of beer and wine, although spirits used as an alimentary substance are everywhere recognized to be a poison. For the whole century, governments struggled in vain against the European opium. Economics prevailed and dictated its orders to consumption. Why are cotton, potatoes, and spirits the pivots of bourgeois society? Because the least amount of labor is needed to produce them, and consequently, they have the lowest price. Why do the minimum price determine the maximum consumption? Is it by any chance because of the absolute utility of these objects, their intrinsic utility, their utility insomuch as they correspond in the most useful manner in the needs of the worker as a man, and not as a man as a worker? No, it is because in a society founded on poverty, the poorest products have fatal prerogative of being used in the greatest number. To say now that because the least costly things are in greater use, they must be of greater utility, is saying that the wide use of spirits, because of their low cost of production, is the most conclusive proof of their utility. It is telling the proletarian that potatoes are more wholesome for him than meat. It is accepting the present state of affairs. In short, making an apology, with Mr. Proudhon, for a society without understanding it. In a future society, which class antagonisms have ceased, in which there will no longer be any classes, use will no longer be determined by the minimum time of production, but the time of production devoted to different articles will be determined by the degree of their social utility. To return to Mr. Proudhon's thesis, the moments of labor time necessary for the production of the article cause the expression to its degree of utility. The exchange value of the same article, determined beforehand by the labor time embodied in it, becomes quite unstable to regulate the true relation of supply and demand, that is, the proportional relation in the sense Mr. Proudhon at the moment attributes to it. It is not the sale of a given product at the price of its cost of production that constitutes the, quote, proportional relation of supply and demand, or the proportional quota of this product's relative to the sum total of production. It is the variations in supply and demand that show the product's what amounts to a given commodity he must produce in order to receive in exchange the least cost of production. And these variations are continuously occurring. There are also a continuous movement to withdrawal and application of capital in the different branches of industry. Quote, it is only in the consequence of such variations that capital is appropriated precisely in the requisite abundance and no more to the production of the different commodities which happen to be in demand. With the rise or fall of price, profits are elevated above or depressed below their general level, and capital is either encouraged to enter into or is warned to depart from the particular employments in which the variation has taken place. When we look at the markets of a large town, and observe how regularly they are supplied both with home and foreign commodities, in the quantity at which they are acquired, under all circumstances of varying demand arising from the caprice or taste or a change in the amount of population, without often producing either the effects of a glut from a too abundant supply, or an enormously high price from the supply being unequal to the demand, we must confess that the price of which apportions capital to each trade in the precise amount that is required is more active than is generally supposed, unquote. Ricardo, Volume 1, page 105 and 108. If Mr. Proudhon admits that the value of products is determined by labor time, he should equally admit that it is the fluctuating movements alone that in society founded on individual exchanges make labor the measure of value. There is no ready-made constituted, quote, proportional relation, but only a constituting movement. We have just seen in what sense it is to speak of proportion as of a consequence of value determined by labor time. We shall see now how this measure by time, called by Mr. Proudhon the law of proportion, becomes transformed into the law of disproportion. Every new invention that enables the production in 1 hour of what has hitherto been produced in 2 hours depreciates at similar products on the market. Competition forces the producer to sell products of 2 hours as cheaply as the product of 1 hour. Competition carries into effect the law according to which the relative value of products is determined by the labor time needed to produce it. Labor time serving as the measure of marketable value becomes in this way the law of continual depreciation of labor. We will say more. There will be depreciation not only of the commodities bought into the market, but also of the instrument of production and of whole plants. This fact was already pointed out by Ricardo when he said, quote, by constantly increasing the facility of production, we constantly diminish the value of some of the commodities before produced. Sismondi goes further. He sees in this value constituted by labor time the source of all contradictions of modern industry and commerce. Quote, mercantile value. Quote, mercantile value, he says, is always determined by the long run by the quantity of labor needed to obtain things evaluated. It is not what it actually costs, but what it would cost in the future with perhaps perfected means, and this quantity, although difficult to evaluate, is always faithfully established by competition. It is on this basis that the demand of the seller, as well as the supply of the buyer, is reckoned. The former will perhaps declare that the thing has cost him 10 days of labor, but if the latter realizes that it can henceforth be produced with 8 days of labor, in the event of competition proving this to the two contradicting parties, the value will be reduced, and the market price fixed to 8 days only. Of course, each of the parties believes that the thing is useful, that it is desired, that without desire there will be no sale, but the fixing of price has nothing to do with utility, unquote. At 2 days, etc., Volume 2, page 267. It is important to emphasize the point that what determines the value is not the time taken to produce a thing, but the minimum time it could possibly be produced in, the minimum in ascertained by competition. Suppose for a moment that there was no more competition, and consequentially no longer any means to ascertain the minimum of labor necessary for the production of a commodity. What will happen then? It will suffice to spend 6 hours' work on the production of an object in order to have the right, according to Mr. Proudhon, to demand in exchange for 6 times as much as one who has taken only 1 hour to produce the same object. Instead of proportional relation, we have a disproportional relation at any rate, if we insist on sticking to relations, good or bad. In the continual depreciation of a labor day, The continual depreciation of labor is only one side, one consequence of the evaluation of commodities by labor time. The excessive raising of prices, overproduction, and many other features of industrial anarchy have their explanation in this mode of evaluation. But does labor time used as a measure of value give rise to at least the proportional variety of products that so delights Mr. Proudhon? On the contrary, monopoly and all of its monotony follows in its wake and invades the world of products. Just as to everybody's knowledge, monopoly invades the world of the instruments of production. It is only in a few branches of industry, like the cotton industry, that very rapidly progress can be made. The natural consequence of this progress is that the products of cotton manufacture, for instance, fall rapidly in price. But as the price of cotton goes down, the price of flax will be replaced by cotton. In this way, flax has been driven out of almost the whole of North America. And we have attained, instead of proportional variety of products, the dominance of cotton. What is left with a proportional relation? Nothing but the pious wish of an honest man who would like commodities to be produced in proportions to which would permit of their soul. Hold on. Nothing but a pious wish of an honest man who would like commodities to be produced in proportions which would permit of their being sold at an honest price. In all ages, good-natured bourgeois and philanthropic economists have taken pleasure in expressing this innocent wish. Let us hear what the old Bois Gilbert says. Quote, "The price of commodities," he says, "must always be proportionate, for it is such a mutual understanding alone that can enable them to exist together so far as to give themselves to one another at any moment." Here is Mr. Proudhon's continuous exchangeability, and reciprocally give birth to one another. Quote, as wealth then is nothing but the continual intercourse between man and man, craft and craft, etc. It is frightful blindness to go looking for the cause of misery elsewhere than in the cessation of such traffic bought. Dissertation et la Nature, Dares edition, page 405 to 408. Bois Gilbert's work is quoted from the Synopsium Economists Financiers. I cannot read that. Let us listen to the modern economist. Quote, "The great law as necessary to be affixed to production, that is, the law of proportion, which alone can be preserved the continuity of value. Quote, the equivalent must be guaranteed. Quote, all nations have attempted at various periods of their history, by instituting numerous commercial regulations and restrictions, to effect, in some degrees, the object here explained. Quote, but the natural and inherent selfishness of man has urged him to break down all such regulations. Proportionate production is the realization of the entire truth of the science of social economy." Unquote. W. Atkinson, Principles on Political Economy, London, 1840, page 170 to 95. Fut Troja, Troy is no more. This true proportion between supply and demand, which is the beginning once more of the object of so many wishes, ceased long ago to exist. It has passed into the stage of senility. It was possibly only at a time when the means of production were limited, when the movement of exchange took place within very restricted bounds. With the birth of large-scale industry, this true proportion had come to an end. The production is inevitably compelled to pass in continuous succession through vicissitudes of prosperity, depression, crisis, stagnation, renewed prosperity, and so on. Those who, like Sismondi, wish to return to the true proportion of production while preserving the present basis of society are reactionary, since to be consistent, they must also wish to bring back all of the other conditions of industry of former times. What kept production in true, or more or less true, proportions? It was demand and dominated supply that preceded it. Production followed close to the heels of consumption. Large-scale industry, forced by the very instruments at which its disposal to produce on an ever-increasing scale, can no longer wait for demand. Production precedes consumption. Supply compels demand. In existing society, an industry based on individual exchange, anarchy of production, which is the source of so much misery, is at the same time the source of all progress. Thus, one or the other. Either you want the true proportions of past centuries with present-day means of production, in which case you are both reactionary and utopian, or you want progress without anarchy, in which case, in order to preserve the productive forces, you must abandon individual exchange. Individual exchange is suited only to the small-scale industry of past centuries with its corollary of, quote, true proportion, or else to large-scale industry with all of the trains of misery and anarchy. After all, the determination of value by labor time, the formula Mr. Proudhon gives us as regenerating formula of the future, is thereby merely the scientific expression of the economic relations of present-day society, as was clearly and precisely demonstrated by Ricardo long before Mr. Proudhon. But what does the equalitarian application of this formula at least belong to Mr. Proudhon? Was he the first to think of reforming society by transforming all men into actual workers exchanging equal amounts of labor? Is it really for him to reproach the communists? These people devoid of all knowledge of political economy, these, quote, obstinately foolish men, these, quote, paradise dreamers, with not having found before him this, quote, solution to the problem of the proletariat. Anyone who is in any way familiar with the trend of political economy in England cannot fail to know that almost all the socialists in the country have, at different periods, proposed the equalitarian applications of Ricardian theory. We quote for Mr. Proudhon, Hodgkin, Political Economy, 1827, William Thomson, in inquiring the principle of distribution of wealth most conducive to human happiness, 1824. T.R. Edmonds' Practical, Moral, and Political Economy, etc., and 4 pages of more, etc. We shall content ourselves with listening to an English communist, Mr. Bray. We shall give the decisive passages to his remarks work, Labor Wrongs and Labor Remedy, Leeds, 1839, and we shall dwell some time upon it. Firstly, before Mr. Bray is still little known in France, and secondly, because we think we have discovered in him the key to the past, present, and future works of Mr. Proudhon. Oh, thank God it's almost done. All right. The only way to arrive at truth is to go at once to first principles. Let us go once to the source from whence governments themselves have arisen. By thus going to the origin of a thing, we shall find every form of government and every social government wrong owes its rise to the existing social system, to the institution of property as it present exists, and that, therefore, we would end our wrongs and our miseries at once and forever. The present arrangements of society must be totally subverted. By thus fighting them upon their own ground and with their own weapons, we shall avoid that senseless chatter respecting visionaries and theorists, in which they are so ready to assail all which who dare move one step from the beating track which by authority has been pronounced to be the right one. Before the conclusions arrived at by such a course of proceeding can be overthrown, the economists must unsay or disprove those established truths and principles on which their own arguments are founded, unquote. That is from Bray, page 17 and 41. It is labor alone which bestows value. Every man has undoubted right to all of the honest labor can procure him. Then when he appropriates the fruits of his labor, he commits no injustice upon any other human being, for he interferes with no other man's right of doing the same with the products of his labor. All these ideas are superior and inferior, of master and man, may be traced to the neglect of the first principles and to the consequent rise of inequality of possessions, and such ideas will never be subverted. So long as inequality is maintained, men of Hithrow blindly hoped to remedy the present unnatural state of things by destroying existing inequality, but it will be shortly seen that government is not a cause, but a consequence, that it is not the creator, but the created. It is the offspring of inequality in possessions, and that inequality of possessions is inseparably connected with our present social system. Bray, page 33, 36, and 37. Not only are the greatest advantages, but strict justice is also on the side of a system of equality. Every man is a link in the chain of effects, beginning of which is but an idea, and the end, perhaps the production of a piece of cloth. Thus, although we may entertain different feelings towards the several parties, it does not follow that one should be better paid for his own labor than another. The inventor will ever receive, in addition to his just pecuniarity, a reward, which genius can only obtain from us, the tribune of our admiration. Quote, from the very nature of labor and exchange, strict justice not only requires all exchangers should be mutually, but they should likewise be equally benefited. Men have only two things which they can exchange with each other, namely labor and the produce of labor. Quote, if a justice system of exchanges were acted upon, the value of articles would be determined by an entire cost of production, and equal value should always be exchanged for equal values. If, for instance, It takes a hatter one day to make a hat and a shoemaker at the same time for a pair of shoes. Supposedly, the material used by each to be of the same value, and they exchange these articles with each other. They are not only mutually but equally benefited. The advantage derived by either party cannot be a disadvantage to the other, as each has given the same amount of labor, and the materials made use by each one were equal value. But if the hatter should obtain the 2 pairs of shoes for one hat, time and value of material being as before, the exchange would clearly be an unjust one. The hatter would be defraud the shoemaker one day's labor, and where the former to act thus as his exchanges, he would receive for the labor half a year, the produce of some other person's whole year. We must therefore act it upon no others than most of the unjust system of exchanges. The workmen here have given the capitalists the labor for a whole year in exchange for the value of only half of the year. And from this, not from the assumed inequality of bodily and mental powers in individuals, has arisen the inequality of wealth and power which at present exists around us. It is an inevitable condition, inequality of exchanges, of buying of one price and selling another, that capitalists shall continue to be capitalists and working men to be working men. The one class of tyrants and the other class of slaves to eternity. Quote, the whole transaction, therefore, plainly shews that the capitalists and proprietors do not then give the working man for his labor 1 week a part of wealth which they obtained from him the week before, which amounts to giving him nothing for something. The whole transaction, therefore, between the producer and the capitalist is a palpable deception, a mere farce. It is, in fact, in 1,000 instances, no other than a barefaced through legalized robbery. Bray, page 45, 48, 49, and 50. Quote, the gain of the employer will never cease to be the loss of the employed until the exchanges between the parties are equal, and exchanges can never be equal while society is divided into capitalists and producers. The last living upon the labor is the first bloating upon the profit of the labor. It is plain that establish wherever form of government we will, we may talk of the morality and brotherly love. No reciprocity can exist where there are unequal exchanges. Inequality of exchanges, as being the cause of inequality of possessions, is the secret enemy that devours us. It has been deducted also from a consideration of the intention of the end of society, not only that men should labor and thereby become exchangers, but that equal values should always exchange for equal values, and that as the gain of one man ought to never be the loss of another, value should be determined by the cost of production. But we have seen that under the present arrangements of society, the gain of the capitalist and the rich man is always the loss of the workman, and this result will inevitably take place, and the poor man will be left entirely at the mercy of the rich man under any and every form of government, so long as there is an equality of exchanges, and the equality of exchanges can be ensured only under social arrangements in which labor is universal. Quote, if exchanges were equal, would be the wealth of the present capitalists gradually go from there to the working classes. So long as this system of unequal exchanges is tolerated, the producers will be almost as poor and as ignorant, as hard worked as they are at present. Even if every governmental burthen be swept away and all taxes be abolished, nothing but total changes the system. And inequality of labor and exchanges can alter the state of rights. The producers have but to make an effort, and by them must every effort for their own redemption be made, and their chains will be snapped asunder forever. As an end, the political economy is there a failure. As a means, also it is there a failure. Quote, where equal exchanges are maintained, the gain of one man cannot be the loss of another. For every exchange is simply a transfer, and not a sacrifice of labor and wealth. Thus, although under the social system based on equal exchanges, a parsimonious man may become rich, his wealth will be no more than the accumulated produce of his own labor. He may exchange his wealth, or he may give it to others, but a rich man cannot continue wealthy for any length of time after he has ceased to labor. Under equality of exchanges, wealth cannot have, as it now has, a procreative and apparently self-generating power, such as replenishes all waste from consumption, for unless it is renewed by labor, wealth, once consumed, is given up forever. that which now called for profit and interests cannot exist such in connection with equality in exchanges, for producer and distributor would be alike remunerated, and the sum total of their labor would determine the value of the article created and brought to the land of the consumer. Quote, the principle of exchanges, therefore, must from its very nature ensure universal labor. Bray, pages 67, 88, 89, 94, and then 109 to 110. After having refuted the objections of the economists to communism, Mr. Bray goes on to say, quote, if then a change of character be essential to the success of the social system of community in its most perfect form, and if, likewise, the present system affords no circumstance and no facilities for effecting the requisite change of characters and preparing man for a higher and better state desired, it is evident that these things must necessarily remain as they are, or as some proprietary step to be discovered and made use of. Some movement partaking partly in the present and partly of the desired system. Some intermediate resting place, to which society may go with all of its faults and follies, and from which it may move forward, imbued with those qualities and attributes without which the system of community and equality cannot as such have existence. Quote, the whole movement would require only cooperation in its simplest form. Cost of production would, in every instance, determine value, and equal values would always exchange for equal values. If one person worked a whole week and another worked only half a week, the first would receive double the remuneration of the last. But this extra pay of the one would not be at the expense of the other, nor would the loss incurred by the last man fall in any way upon the first. Each person would exchange the wages he individually received for commodities of the same value as of his respected wages, and in no case could the gain of one man or one trade be a loss to another man or another trade. The labor of every individual alone could determine his gain of his loss. By means of general and local boards of trade, the quantities of various commodities required for consumption, the relative value of each in regard to each other, the number of hands required in various trades and descriptions of labor, and all other matters connected with the production and distribution, could in short time be as easily determined for a nation as for an individual company under the present arrangements. Quote, as individuals compose families and families towns under the existing system, so likewise would they alter the joint stock change had been effected. The present distribution of people in towns and villages, bad as it is, would not be directly interfered with. Quote, under this joint stock system, the same as under now existing, every individual would be at liberty to accumulate as much as he pleased, and to enjoy such accumulations when and where he might think proper. Quote, the great productive section of community is divided into an indefinite number of smaller sections, all working, producing, and exchanging their products on a footing of the most perfect equality. And the joint stock modifications, by being so constituted as to admit of individual property and production in connection with a common property and productive powers, making every individual developments on his own exertions, and at the same time allowing him an equal participation in every advantage afforded by nature and art, is fitted to take society as it is, and to prepare the way for another and better changes, unquote. Bray, page 158, 160, 62, 168, and 94. We now only need to reply in a few words to Mr. Bray, who, without us and in spite of us, has managed to supplant Mr. Proudhon, except that Mr. Bray, far from claiming the last words on behalf of humanity, proposes merely measures which he thinks good for a period of transition between existing society and a community regime. 1 hour of Peter's labor exchanges for 1 hour of Paul's labor. That is Mr. Bray's fundamental axiom. Let us suppose Peter has 12 hours of labor before him and Paul only has 6. Peter will consequently have 6 hours labor left over. What will he have to do with those 6 hours of labor? Either he will do nothing with them, in which case he will have worked 6 hours for nothing, or he will remain idle for another 6 hours to get even, or else, as a last resource, he will give these 6 hours labor, which he has no use for, to Paul into the bargain. What in the end will Peter have earned more than Paul? Some hours of labor? No, he will have gained only hours of leisure. he will be forced to pay the loafers for 6 hours. And in order for this new right to loaf might not be only relished but sought after the new society. This society would have to find in idleness the highest bliss, and to look upon labor as a heavy shackle from which it must break free at all costs. And indeed, to return to our example, if only these hours of leisure that Peter had gained in excess to Paul were really a gain. Not in the least. Paul, beginning by working only 6 hours, attains by steadily regular work. As a result, Peter secures only by beginning with an excess of work. Everyone will want to be Paul. There will be a competition to occupy Paul's position, a competition in idleness. Well then, what has the exchange of equal quantities of labor brought us? Overproduction, depreciation, excess of labor followed by unemployment. In short, economic relations such as we see in present-day society, minus the competition of labor. No, we are wrong. These are still an expedients which may save the society of Peter and Paul's. Peter will consume by himself the product of 6 hours of labor which he has left. But the moments he has no longer to exchange because he has produced, he has no need to produce for exchange. And the whole hypothesis of society founded on exchange and division of labor will fall to the ground. Equality of exchange will have been saved by the simple fact that exchange will have ceased to be. Paul and Peter would have arrived at the position of Robinson. Thus, if all the members of society are supposed to be actual workers, the exchange of equal quantities of labor hours is possible only on condition that the number of hours to be spent on material production is agreed on beforehand. But such an agreement negates individual exchange. We still come to the same results. If we take our starting point, not the distribution of the products created by the act of production, in large-scale industry, Peter is not free to fix for himself the time of his labor. For Peter's labor is nothing without the cooperation of all of Peter and all of Paul's who make up the workshop. This explains very well the dogged resistance which the English factory owners put up to the 10 hours bill. They knew only too well that a 2-hour reduction of labor granted to women and children would carry with it an equal reduction in working hours for adult men. It is in the nature of large-scale industry that working hours should be equal for all. What is today the result of capital and the competition of workers among themselves will be tomorrow if you sever the relations between labor and capital, an actual agreement based upon the relation between the sums of productive forces and the sums of existing needs. But such an agreement is a condemnation of individual exchange, and we are brought back again to our first conclusion. In principle, there is no exchange of products. There is an exchange of labor which cooperated in production. The mode of exchange of products depends upon the mode of exchange of the productive forces. In general, the form of exchange of products corresponds with the form of production. Change in the latter, and the former will change in consequence. Thus, in the history of society, we see the mode of exchanging products is regulated by the mode of producing them. Individual exchange corresponds also as a definite mode of production, which corresponds to class antagonism. There is no individual exchange without antagonism of classes. But the respectable conscience refuses to see this obvious fact. So long as one is a bourgeois, one cannot see but this relation of antagonism in relation to harmony and eternal justice, which allows no one to gain at the expense of another. For the bourgeoisie, individual exchange cannot exist without any antagonism of class. For him, these are two quite unconnected things. Individual exchange, as the bourgeoisie conceives it is far from resembling individual exchange as it actually exists in practice. Mr. Bray turns the illusion of the respectable bourgeois into an ideal he would like to attain, in a purified individual exchange, freed from all the elements of antagonism he finds in it. He sees an egalitarian relation which he would like society to adopt generally. Mr. Bray does not see this excuse me.
Equalitarian.
Thank you. Holy crap.
You can just say egalitarian. I think it's all good.
I'm finishing this. Mr. Bray does not see this equalitarian relation, this corrective ideal that he would like to apply to the world, is itself nothing but the reflection of the actual world, and that therefore it is totally impossible to reconstitute society on the basis of what is merely an embellished shadow of it. In proportion to this shadow takes on substance again, we perceive that this substance, far from being the transfiguration dreamt of, is an actual body of existing society. And with that being said, I think I'm going to wrap up, and we should do this again sometime because I am burned out and it's already 2 hours.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, I mean, I just read like 3 times as much text as you.
Yeah, I sent a message. I didn't know if you wanted me to interrupt you, but I could have like read half of that if you wanted. But
yeah, it's no biggie. We'll continue this again either next week, or if you guys would like us to read a different piece of literature next week, and then we can put Poverty of Philosophy on the back burner. That's an option on the table too. But anyways, you think we should discuss this in the Discord?
Oh yeah, definitely.
All right.
Just thank you for everybody that came. I see we have a good bit of people here. 14 people. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Read theory.
Yeah, that's what, and we're going to discuss it too. So I'm going to post this link in the Discord, or post the Discord link. So yeah, just go ahead and take that invite, and anybody who wants to, talk about Poverty of Philosophy, I'll give you the study mate role, and then we can meet in the study circle. Sayonara, guys.
Yeah.